All right, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome back. In general, what impression did you get from what we discussed in the last two lectures? So much stuff, right? So confusing. All of them got different ideas. What's the truth? And believe it or not, Greeks felt the same way because those were philosophers, right? They were coming up with these different ideas, but the Greeks themselves were listening to them and going, wait a minute, this philosopher says it's that, the other philosopher says it's the other thing. Somebody says the water is the underlying reality, somebody says air. So what did they feel like? You should not listen to any of them. All these people, all they are saying is complete nonsense. So that is basically what brings us to this anthropological period, so-called anthropological, beginning from around 450 to BC, the middle of the 5th century BC, roughly. There's no clear line. We start anthropological period. What does it mean anthropological? What is anthropos? Anybody know? Yeah. Yeah, anthropology is the study of humans, and they get it from the Greek word anthropos, which actually means human being. Human being. That's what it means. So the word anthropology is derived from that. So this is the period which kind of brings it back to human beings, human issues. Issues which all of us are dealing with rather than these abstract things. Centered with human-centered issues, asking questions about knowledge and conduct specifically. How should we live our life? That's something everybody's concerned with, right? Not so much whether the underlying reality is this or that, but how should we live? What should we do? There's two parts to it, the Sophists and Socrates. There's like a quarrel between them, you may say. Sophists were a whole group of people, skeptical, practical. They were teaching so-called wisdom to anybody who would pay them money. Socrates was different. He actually wants to find the objective knowledge and objective truth, and he does not charge for it. So let's start with getting some overall view of what was going on in Greece at the time. This period of time, around 450 BC, in fact, the entire period around that date is considered golden age of Greece. This is when they get the democracy. The word democracy is a Greek word. Demos, kratos, power of the people. And the Greeks invented it. Also, their culture was among the most developed at the time. Architecture, art. If you go to art museum, if you ever start study art history, you will probably at the very beginning of the course talk about Greek art, which is considered the golden standard. Amazing sculptures which look just like real human beings. Amazing drama. They had theater, the Greek theater, tragedy. All of this was booming. Specifically in this period of time, golden age. However, at the same time, moral disintegration. Morally, people were getting worse and worse. This is from Thucydides, from his history of the Peloponnesian War. The quote, the common meaning of words was turned about at men's pleasure. The most reckless bravado was deemed the most desirable friend. A man of prudence and moderation was styled a coward. A man who listened to reason was good for nothing, simple. So people were getting more cynical. They wanted to achieve success. They wanted to be recognized, get money, get power, and they did not pay very much attention to morality. Why? Four causes we can name at the very least. This is the most important causes of this. First of all, the respect for the cultural authorities. Remember, the Homer, Hesiod has declined. Why? Philosophers are partly to blame for this too. They were questioning all that, and what people got from this is like, okay, Homer is wrong, Hesiod is wrong, philosophers are wrong. Who's right? Nobody's right. Right? So no authority. Why should we listen for all these people, to all these people? Loss of the metaphysical foundation of values. Remember that for Homer, the excellence of the warrior was important. So once we throw that out, there's not very much left. Second reason, increased contact with different cultures, customs, and laws. Why do you think that was problematic? So they traveled more, they knew more about other cultures. Seems like a great thing, isn't it? But what could go wrong there? Yeah.
That other cultures had different beliefs, so then they were both maybe cause problems between the two cultures to see who was right.
Exactly. Other cultures do things differently. We always thought the way we do things is the great way, the best way to do it, but they do it differently and they think their way is the great. And this culture has things even differently and they think it's great. So is any way really great? Seems like no way great. Whatever people are doing is just, well, they decided to do it this way, but if you can get away without any consequences and doing it differently, go ahead. So that's another reason. The third reason, the rise of democratic lawmaking made it difficult to assume divine origins of one society. But that's generally a problem with democracy, right? Under tyranny, the tyrant is supposed to be like God-like figure. The tyrant knows everything. He is directly related to God. But in democracy, we learn that all the politicians are people like us. And in fact, many of us would say even worse, right? You look at politicians, they get elected through some sort of clever manipulation, then they make all the decisions, but we all know better than they do. So democracy in that sense is definitely detrimental to this kind of feeling of any authority. In democracy, usually you don't have authority. Plurality of opinions among the philosophers and scientists, that's another thing which we already mentioned. All philosophers were coming up with these wonderful systems, and they're all different. So from a common person's point of view, they're all nonsense. This philosopher says this, and another philosopher contradicts him, and the third one contradicts both of these ones. So probably all of them are wrong. Okay, let's look at some other stuff, the practical approach. So many people looked at it from this practical point of view. They thought, what's in it for me, right? Metaphysics doesn't matter as much. They all contradict each other, but I want to know, can I myself have a good life? Can I have what I expect? And this is where the Sophists kind of came in. Sophists, they're a type of professional educators. The word sophos or sophistes initially meant something like a professor, somebody who teaches you wisdom. Professional educators. Until this quarrel with Socrates, they were actually didn't have a bad reputation. Today, when you use the word sophist, I don't know if you ever heard this sophism or sophist, it has a very negative connotation. But at the time, it was not. So what did they teach specifically? It's kind of a combination in like today's terms, you can say, of like philosophy 102, the critical thinking class, psychology, communications 101, that type of thing. So first of all, language and rhetoric. They taught people to speak well. Why? Because during the assembly, and not just assembly, in fact, in Greece, as we will also see with Socrates, for example, they had courts, right? And you could take somebody to court if you thought they wronged you. But they did not have professional lawyers. So what happens if, for example, you accuse your neighbor of doing something to you? You have to take them to court yourself and present your accusation, act as a prosecutor yourself, and your neighbor has to defend themselves also themselves. They don't have anybody to do it for them. They stand in front of the assembly. Usually, the jury there was very large. In Socrates' case, 500 people. And those are jury, just like we have the 12 people, except they are very large, and the people there are usually randomly selected. And you have to convince them. But who can convince them better? The people who speak better, right? If you are good at speaking and convincing other people, you will get better results. So no matter whether you really are guilty or not, you can get away with something even if you are guilty, or on the contrary, if you are innocent and somebody accused you and they are a good speaker, they can get you to jail. So that's why it was so important to understand rhetoric. Rhetoric is the art of speaking, right? The other thing related to this heuristic, anti-logic, and dialectics, we'll talk more about that because this is what kind of they were practicing heuristics, is the type of back and forth argument. When you talk to somebody, they respond to you, you continue asking them questions. This is what Socrates will also be doing, but in a slightly different way. Anti-logic is when you present two different points of view. You're capable of presenting the same view from two different angles. And dialectic is kind of like this Socratic method of seeking the truth through this questioning. And it is also related to the previous two, but slightly different. Then epistemology, how do we know what is true? That was still kind of interesting to people. Can we know what is true? Theology, this is study of the gods. And finally, ethics and politics, because politics was very popular. People wanted to be politicians. They wanted to achieve something in life in this way. So sophists were teaching all this. In fact, they were teaching it to children most of the time. Rich parents could pay them so their children could take these lessons, like the tutor, right? The sophist would come and teach them how to achieve their goals in life. And another Greek word which we kind of need to know now, arete. We have a teaching, arete. What exactly is arete? Well, remember that for Homer, the ideal human being was success, honor, power, wealth, security, courage. That is what they called arete. The exact meaning of the word in English, it's usually translated in most books as virtue, but it is a little bit different from virtue. In fact, it is kind of like human excellence. What does it mean for a human being to be excellent? You can look at it in this example. If it's a knife also has an arete. An arete of a knife is to be a good knife, cut very well. Right? So the purpose of knife is to cut things. If the knife cuts things well, knife has arete. We don't say in English knife has virtue, but if you think about human being, if human being does things which humans supposed to do well, we would say that is a virtuous person. It has a little bit of a weird sound to it in English now, but for Greeks, to say the person has arete just meant it's an excellent person. It's a very good human being, right? So they would assume that there is such thing as good human being behavior, good human purpose, and therefore arete of a human being. Protagoras, let's look at some of the famous sophists. That's actually an interesting topic in itself. Protagoras was one of the most famous, and we got some information about him from Plato in particular. Here's a couple of quotes. But supposedly Protagoras saying, "My boy, if you associate with me, the result will be that the very day you begin, you will return home a better person. And the same will happen the next day. Each day you will make constant progress towards being better. So he will teach you arete. You will be better." Shortly afterwards, he goes more specific about what he teaches. He says, "Good counsel concerning his personal affairs," right? How to conduct your personal affairs, so that he may best manage his own household. And also concerning the city's affairs. So good border, right? Good in terms of democracy. So that as far as the city's affairs go, he may be most powerful in acting and speaking. So it seems like common sense stuff, right? You want, first of all, if you're head of the family, you want your family to be good. So how do you achieve that? Some economic common sense in terms of like How do you distribute different roles in your family and so on? Similarly with the city, if you participate in democracy, you should also be effective. You should be able to, first of all, convince other people if you think something is a good idea. And this is what they were teaching. They were not really trying to make it too complicated, but this is something most people would agree. Yeah, I want my children to know this, so I'll pay you and you teach them. His famous saying, Protagoras' famous saying, was this: man is the measure of all things, of those that are what they are, and of those that are not that they are not. Interesting thing. It actually, there are different ways to understand it. We are not completely sure what it means. Let's think about it. Man is the measure of all things. What does it mean? What could it mean?
Man creates all things.
Hmm?
Man creates everything.
It's a measure, right? Okay, so man creates everything, including what? Would it include questions such as what is good and what is bad, morality? Yeah, it seems like that's possibly what he means here, right? So if man decides that, I don't know, eating children is good, then it's good. But if man decides it's bad, then it's bad. The question here, of course, is it one man or is it all men, as in humanity as a whole? Because there could be difference here. For example, you can say, I think it's good, so it is good for me. But you think it's bad, so it is bad for you. Or you can say, well, if majority of people think it's good, then it is good, even if you disagree. Right? So it's a different thing. However, he definitely thinks that there is no universal type thing like God-given commandments. Right? So how do we know that it is not good to murder other people? Not because God told us so, but because we don't want to be murdered, right? If you think it's a good idea, then possibly you'll be murdered one day. That's not fun. So clearly we should agree not to murder anybody. That seems like man is the measure of all things. If a man thinks it's a bad idea, then that's how it should be. But of course, it is also a little bit dangerous because then it may be tempting to say, well, I'm a man, and I think that, sometimes stealing is a good idea when I can get more from you than you can get from me. Should I stop stealing then or not? Suppose I can get away with it. What can prevent me from doing it? Other people think it's a bad idea, but they will never find out. Yeah, but I'm better at it, so I can do more. You can steal something from me, but I'll steal so much more from you. So it seems like it works. Is there any reason for me not to do it? This measure is so. Socrates will disagree with it completely, but that is just the general sophistic approach. And another thing, remember I mentioned it, anti-logic. Anti-logic, basically, here's what it says about Protagoras. He was the first to declare that there are two mutually opposed arguments on any subject. So the Sophists sometimes will just do it. They can argue two opposing points. Like, let's imagine, how can somebody do it? Well, we have like Democrats and Republicans, right? And they disagree about things like abortion. Could you argue two opposing points on abortion? Yeah. So they could, for example, make a speech saying abortion is bad. We should not do abortion, and then list all the reasons why we should not do abortion. Then immediately switch and make an opposite statement. Abortion is good. We should do more of this. There's nothing wrong with it whatsoever. And defend that too. So it seems cynical, but to them it meant understanding issues a little bit better. Because what goes problematic when people disagree about anything, including this kind of issue, they do not listen to the other side. Right? They don't want to know what the other side thinks. The other side is always wrong, and they are always right, which is clearly impossible. So in that sense, understanding the other side helps you understand the issue better. And Sophists really try to work with that too. Then another famous sophist was Gorgias. Gorgias was not teaching arithmetic, he was just teaching rhetoric. Language and rhetoric, the art of speech. So basically, he could just argue certain points and teach students how to argue them well. Here's his famous thesis from his famous work, based, by the way, on the work of Parmenides. Remember, Parmenides had a similar thing. So he was kind of making fun of Parmenides in a sense, but also showing that if you follow that type of logic, here's what you can reach. He was saying, well, first of all, nothing exists. You can say, how? That doesn't make any sense. But he would argue, well, if being is eternal, it's unlimited, right? But if it's unlimited, it's nowhere. Where is it? It has no place, so it doesn't exist at all. Another following topic. Okay, if anything does exist, it is unknowable. We can never know it. Why can't we know it? Because subject of thought is not being but thought. Thought is in your head. You know things in your head, but the reality is not in your head. So how can you ever know it? That is similar to what we said last time, and that how do you know you sense things, that things are really in front of you? How do you know it's not fake? And he was saying, you don't know if it's fake. It could be fake. And finally, even if it is knowable, it cannot be communicated. You cannot explain it to somebody else. Why? Because you use words, but words are not things. So if you tell somebody something, how do you know they understand it the same way as you understand? Well, of course, it's kind of like a little bit of a joke in this sense. But basically what he was trying to show is with logic, you can prove almost anything, any kind of nonsense. And that to him was nonsense, but he was just honestly showing that it can lead to nonsense. It's just a question of whether you want to convince somebody or not. The famous debate, which was present at the time, is this physis and nomos debate. What exactly do these two words mean? Physis, remember we kind of mentioned that it's nature. The word physics comes from. And nomos is the laws or regulations of some sort. So what debate was about is issues, do things exist by nature or do they exist by human convention? Humans make things up. Among some of the topics, do gods exist in nature or only by custom? So are they really gods or is it just a custom for us to believe in? Right, so like kind of like everybody goes to church, so I'll go to church too. Everybody pretends to believe in God, I'll pretend. Because if I don't, others will say, well, you're not like us, well, you're better than us or something. But is there really God or not? Another question, does human society exist as a result of human nature or by convention? So is there some fundamental way which reality should be by nature, intended? Or is it whatever we decide? Is morality natural or a product of custom? Again, that is all related to this previous debate. Is there optimal political state arrangement or is it whatever we decide? So for example, is democracy better than tyranny? Or is it just because we decided democracy, they decided to have tyranny, so democracy works for us, tyranny works for them. Nobody's right, nobody's wrong. But note that, like, especially in America, we actually believe democracy is better and everybody should have democracy, right? But some countries don't have democracy. So we think they should still get a democracy. But other countries, sometimes people are saying, but we don't want it this way. We actually prefer the way we are, not necessarily tyranny, but like one ruler. We like this. He's a great guy. We don't want anybody else. So that is one of those questions. Is there such thing as natural way for us to rule the country? Or is it just whatever we think is best? If we think this is best, then it is. So this is this Physis Nomos debate. Let's read a few things from Herodotus, which can kind of help us illustrate it. If all humans were told to select the best nomoi, nomoi is the plural of nomos, law or convention, from all that are, each people would, upon consideration, choose its own. There is a vast amount of evidence for this fact, including the following. When Darius was the king of the Persian Empire, he summoned the Greeks who were at his court and asked how much money would it take for them to eat the corpses of their fathers. They responded that they would not do it for any price. Afterwards, Darius summoned some Indians called Kalatai, who do eat their parents, and asked in the presence of Greeks, who understood through interpreters, for what price would they agree to cremate their dead fathers, the way Greeks were doing. Greeks were actually cremating. Yeah. They cried out loudly and told him to keep still. That is what people's customs are, and I think Pindar was right when he wrote that Nomos is a king of all. So you see his point. This is actual history. Herodotus wrote history, so that actually did happen. They had this group of people who were eating their parents. They thought it was a good idea. I guess show them respect. They die, we eat them, they become part of it. The Greeks were burning them. So when they offered to the Greeks the opportunity to eat their parents, they were offended and said, we're not going to do it for anything. But when they told this other group, how about you burn your parents instead of eating them, they were also offended. It's disrespecting our parents, burning them. That's not good. You have to eat them. So that kind of illustrates the point at the time, right? This is how they were looking at it. So this Physis and Nomos debate was over things like traditional morality. And you can see how morality disintegrating kind of created this debate, and it was very important. So that kind of explains us, we can get closer to Socrates. Now, the last person to mention, Antiphon, that's another one of the Sophists, and he was more cynical in this way. So this is what he was saying. A man will be just in a way most advantageous to himself if in the presence of witnesses he holds the law of the city, nomoi, in high esteem, and in the absence of witnesses, when he is alone, the laws of nature. So in other words, what? Laws of nature. What would be laws of nature in this sense? What you would look at it like, I don't know, that sexual indulgences, right? Whatever other pleasures. It seems like they are kind of natural because all human beings have desires. But the society tells us sometimes we can do it. So he says, okay, if the society can see you, don't do it, because they can punish you. But if they don't see you, if you can get away with it, then it's okay. So that's kind of cynical approach, right? Just make sure nobody knows. So if you're doing something which society disagrees with, make sure nobody knows, and you're good. Don't deny yourself just because society disagrees. Okay, now we get into Socrates. This is from one of the museums. This is how Socrates looked like. It's actually probably very close to his actual face. He had snub nose, famous snub nose. According to Greek standards, he was not a pretty person. And in fact, he was not trying to. This is dates of his life. This plus minus 1 year, because their years were a little bit different. I'm not starting on January 1st, so it's a little harder to figure out exactly. But this is roughly where he lived. As you can see that actually in this period of time, so if he was born in 469, how old would he be? 19. It's 19 years old. So those days, 19 years old. But he died in 399, and we know exactly how and when. So one thing in philosophy is known as Socratic prose. What is Socratic prose? We know Socrates existed, but Socrates has never written anything. There is no writing of Socrates. So how do we know what was he doing? What was he teaching? Only from the words of others. There are several sources who tell us things about Socrates. The most famous one is Plato. We'll talk about Plato next week. Plato was a student of Socrates. He loved him dearly. He was completely shocked about what happened to Socrates. And then he started writing this dialogue. So maybe even before Socrates died. We don't know exactly. So most of what we know, all these dialogues of Socrates as a character, and Socrates constantly talks to other people and has certain ideas. But there is a problem because can you really trust Plato? How sure can you be that he is telling us the truth about Socrates? That's problematic, right? There are a couple of other people who also mention Socrates, but not as much. One of them is Xenophon. Xenophon was also kind of unrelated person at the time. He didn't write very much, but what he wrote about Socrates is somewhat different from Plato. Then there was Aristophanes. Aristophanes was comedic writer, and his Socrates completely different. However, since he was comedic writer, he wrote comedies. His Socrates is more of a caricature. So he probably was not trying to give us the real idea. And finally, Aristotle. Aristotle mentioned some things. However, Aristotle wasn't even alive when Socrates died. He actually was born later. He was a student of Plato when Plato was already well known, much older, and had his own academy. So he probably heard things from Plato, and we can rely on him a little bit more, but he didn't say very much. So there is this eternal question about can we trust Plato, and how much can we trust Plato? However, Plato did tell us many things which we think are historically accurate and correct about Socrates. What exactly were his teachings? So early works of Plato have Socrates somewhat different than later works. And early dialogues he was writing, we'll talk about Plato next. But just for now, early ones are probably more historically accurate. Then he started inventing things, and Socrates started to talk about things which Plato himself was more interested in than Socrates. Right? So he started kind of using Socrates as a mouthpiece for his own ideas. So what do we know from the early one? The first one is the trial of Socrates. That was actually the reading was from the one of the most famous dialogues, the Apology. An apology is Socrates' speech at his trial. He was put on trial. This is a fact. Nobody disputes that. He was put on trial, and he had the jury of 500 trying to decide whether or not he should be punished. Why exactly did they want him to be punished? Well, this is a formal accusation. And remember, they didn't have any lawyers, but there were three people who accused him. Well-known people in Athens at the time. They said Socrates is guilty of corrupting the youth and believing not in gods whom the state believes in, but in other divinities. So first of all, corrupting the youth. They were saying young people follow Socrates and he teaches them bad things. That's one accusation. He was indeed surrounded by this group of young people, and Plato was one of them, who really loved him and listened to what he was doing. And another thing, believing not in gods who the state believes in, well, they actually had an interesting approach to religion. You were not really bound to believe in exactly the same gods, but you were not supposed to say anything about the gods well, it says state, but it actually was polis. It's more like a city, right? Each city had their own gods. And you're not supposed to talk against it. If everybody believes that Athens or something is the official god of the city, you're not supposed to say things like, oh, she doesn't exist. It's all made up. So this is what they were accusing him of. In the dialogue, he mentions old accusers and new accusers. Who are the old accusers and who are the new? New accusers are these three people who actually brought him to court. But he's saying they are not the first one. People had problems with me all my life. Why? Why did people have problems with Socrates? Well, if you read it, even one page he describes how did he become philosopher. What actually happened there? Can somebody say? Yeah.
There was, I forgot the other guy's name, but he asked a god who was the wisest. They said it was him, but he thought there was other people that were like wiser than him, than himself. So he went around questioning their like knowledge. Found out that they think they know stuff, or like claim they know stuff that they don't. But Socrates, he knows stuff, and what he doesn't know, he admits that he doesn't know.
Well, actually, even stronger. He said, I don't know anything. Right? He's honest about it. He said, I don't know anything. So, yeah, exactly. This is exactly right. This is this part from the book when he explains, from the dialogue, where he explains what the oracle at Delphi was supposedly this oracle which was answering questions, and his friend went to talk to Oracle and asked, who is the wisest person on earth? And the oracle said, Socrates. And when his friend told him this, he said, I was completely flabbergasted. I could not believe that. Like, how come? Okay, I'll give you the extra credit for this. So how come? I don't know anything new. So how can I be the wiser? And he said, I wanted to prove the goddess wrong. I wanted to prove that other people are smarter than me. So I went out into the world, started asking them questions. Different people, we started with politicians. And guess what? Turns out that they are even more stupid than he is. He said, at the very least, I don't know anything, and I know I don't know anything. They don't know anything, and they think they know things. And then he said he went to poets, and he tried the same thing with them, and turns out poets don't know anything either. They're writing poetry on some inspiration, but they themselves are rather stupid. And again, the main reason they're stupid, they think they know things. They think they know it more than the rest of us. And finally, he said he went to people of technical expertise. They say experts, right? And they are really knowledgeable in their own disciplines. But the problem they have, they also think they understand everything else. And again, that is wrong. So that's when he said, I realized that perhaps I am the wisest, because at the very least, I can honestly admit that I don't know anything. So that is literally what he was doing. The Oracle of Delphi, yeah, that whole part. He was doing it. He was walking around Athens. He was approaching different people, usually well-known people, and asking them questions very nicely, right? So, for example, he could approach a judge and say, "Oh, Your Honor, you are such a smart man. I don't know anything, but you are an expert. So tell me, what is justice?" And the judge would say, "Oh, it's very simple. Tell him something. Give him a definition of justice, right? So this is dialectic method." And he would say, "Excellent. That is excellent. That is so good. But," and then he would ask additional questions and eventually lead it to the point that the judge would realize what he was saying is a contradiction. It doesn't make sense. Right? So he would basically talk him into a corner. Well, what do you think these well-known famous people felt about this whole process? Pleased with it? Being humiliated in front of all the youngsters who were following Socrates for this reason, right? Not so much. So he got many people who hated him. And that is one of the reasons he was put on trial. This is the quote from another part of this reading. That is what he was saying. "Athenians, I hold you in the highest regard and affection, but I will be persuaded by the god rather than you. As long as I have breath and strength, I will not give up philosophy and exhorting you and declaring the truth to everyone of whom I meet, same as I am accustomed. My good friend, are you not ashamed of caring so much for making of money and of fame and prestige, when you neither think nor care about wisdom and truth and improvement of your soul? So not only did he think that he doesn't know anything, but he was still encouraging other people to learn things for themselves and to reach for wisdom and truth. So this is where Plato starts building more on that. And just a spoiler alert in this, if you read it, he was convicted. They did not believe him. They convicted him. 500 people of the jury split 280 to 220 that he is guilty. Remember the charges, right? Corrupting the youth, not believing in God. They had also like two parts system. In the first part, they determine whether they're guilty or not, but then they determine the punishment. And in order to determine the punishment, they were asking the accused what they think what kind of punishment should they get. So they asked Socrates same thing after they decided to do it when guilty. They asked, so what punishment do you think you deserve? Guess what he answered? That I deserve the 3 meals from the city. That's the punishment I deserve because I'm not guilty of anything, and you people are completely wrong. After he did that, they of course got offended. So even more than 280 people voted for him to be put to death. That's a very harsh punishment. But the idea actually was, as far as we know, they wanted him to leave the city because he was just annoying them so much. They wanted him to leave. They didn't want literally to put him to death. But they thought, well, if we're going to give you a punishment of death, you will have no choice but to run away. So everybody was hoping with it. Another dialogue, they actually go to prison to him and say, we can help you out to run away. But he refused. He said, I don't want to go anywhere. I'm staying here and I'm going to die. You convicted me? You think that I deserve to die? I will die. Of course, it helps that he was 70 years old. It's not exactly like he got a long life ahead of him anyway. But yeah, so he was sentenced to death by drinking poison. This is a famous painting by Jacques-Louis David, which is already like 18th century painter, of course, many years later. And it's just how he imagines the whole thing, right? This is Socrates pointing towards the sky. This is poison, giving him poison. This is his students who are like horrified by this whole thing. So basically, there's another dialogue which describes his death and why he was saying he's not afraid to die. He said, I'm not afraid to die at all. But that impressed Plato, and it impressed many other people. They were all thinking he will eventually run away, but he chose to die instead. And so what he was trying to do, he was thinking that Athenians are becoming too much of money seekers, cynical people, and the Sophists are to blame. They are teaching them this kind of practical approach to life, when in fact he was thinking that there is such thing as the truth, and we should seek the truth and the wisdom. This is more important than money. This is more important than those other pleasures. And he was trying to convince people that they should actually live their life in this kind of way. He also called himself a midwife of ideas. What do you think it means? What does midwife do? You know? Helps deliver a baby. So what would midwife of ideas then?
The ideas?
Yeah, which is you already have this idea, right? So that just like a baby, the baby is already there. What he does is just pulls it out. So similarly, why he called himself midwife of ideas, he was saying that I do not tell you things. I just help you to understand things you already know. It's inside of you, but you may be too confused to realize it. So that's how he saw his purpose in life. Just basically not teaching people anything, but already help them to find the knowledge they already have. If you really work on it, and if you make an effort, you realize that you already understand all these things and know all these things. Plato will take it much further. How much further? Like I said, we're not even sure how much of it Plato himself invented. How different it is from historic Socrates, what he was saying. But there seemed to be some connection because even Aristotle says that he was more concerned with morality, with this moral things. And he really was offended by all the Sophists and their approaches. Truth is written on human mind and soul. Truth is already there within us. It's just a question of discovering. And his famous method was the dialectic. But that's what dialectic is. Just basically approaching people and asking. Sometimes you can even, sometimes they call it Socratic method. You heard that some professors teach classes with Socratic method. What does it mean? They don't tell you things themselves. They ask you questions, and you answer these questions. So this is exactly what Socrates was doing. He was not telling you seek the truth or you should do this and that. He would ask you, like, what are you doing? Are you happy with what you're doing? Do you think you should be doing that? And so on. In most dialects, he would take one specific subject, such as justice. What is justice? Many people think they know what justice is, right? We already mentioned justice several times. It's an important concept. But what is it really? Is there such thing as justice? Like, even if we think about it from our modern perspective, right? We demand justice. What are we demanding? What exactly is justice? Could it be that justice for me is injustice for you and vice versa? Or is it something which is like for all of us? It seems like everybody kind of knows what they're saying when they say justice, but do they? It's been 2,500 years, but did we get any better? You will see that this is all the same questions. We still have them. And there is not any more clarity really than there was back then. But it is that's why it is so fascinating learning this stuff. So this is the method. You would approach somebody on the street, isolate these key terms such as justice or courage. Another dialect talks about courage. What is courage? And so on. What is truth? And then just basically ask other people to teach him, to tell him what it is. Or arete, what is arete? And then in the course of this, it would turn out that they actually don't know what it is, even though they think they do. And people didn't like that. Socratic irony, that's another interesting topic sometimes raised. Why is it irony? Because when he approaches people, he was telling them things. Oh, by the way, do you guys know what irony means?
You say something and you mean another.
Yeah, irony literally means that the actual meaning of the word is the opposite of the meaning intended, right? So when I, for example, say, "Oh, you're so beautiful," but I actually mean that you are ugly, something like this, right? So that's irony. And Socrates, in a similar way, famously was using irony when he was, for example, asking those important people, "Oh, you're a judge. You are so wise. You are so smart. Please tell me." But did he really think they were wise and smart? No, he meant the opposite, right? But that's what irony is. He was approaching it with this ironic approach so that whatever he says should always be taken with a grain of salt. And this is another quote about what was happening as a result. This is from another dialect. Anyone who is close to Socrates and enters into conversation with him is liable to be drawn into an argument. And whatever subject he may start, he will be continually carried round and round by him until at last he finds that he has to give an account both of his present and past life. And when he is once entangled, Socrates will not let go until he was completely and thoroughly sifted. So people could not get away from him. They had to basically defend themselves and explain themselves. and they, of course, hated. And we practically only talk about important people. He was not approaching, some poor guy who has enough trouble. Important people, leaders of the city, judges. So that, of course, is why you made so many enemies, why they wanted him to leave so badly. And if he didn't want to leave, they were ready to put him to death. Even though technically he was not really guilty of anything really bad. Corrupting the youth, he defended himself in this dialogue. He was saying, corrupting the youth, how am I corrupting the youth? I'm telling them that the truth and the honesty are important in life. That's corrupting, or maybe that what you're teaching them is corrupt. But nonetheless, they did not buy that. They thought still he should be put to death. And the most important thing, the most important goal in life for Socrates was the good. The final goal of dialectic is not entertainment. He was not doing it to entertain people. It is to figure out what is the truth and what is the good. What exactly do we mean when we say this is good? Is there such thing as the good? Socrates believed there is. He believed that if you actually understand what is good, you will be a good person. And in fact, one of the other famous things he would say that we only do evil things because we are ignorant. If you actually know the good, you will never do anything evil. And people always question it, say like, come on, there's plenty of people who know what is good, but they still do evil things. Why would Socrates disagree with it? Well, you'd say they probably don't. They probably don't. They don't really understand what is good. Because if you understand what is good, you would not be doing this. So you may think you know them, but you actually don't. To him, knowledge was the good thing in itself. Knowledge really can always lead you to this arete, to the best life. Because if you know what human purpose in life is, you will seek it and you will reach it.